The silence wasn't empty. That's what made it heavy. It was a thick, expensive silence, meant to underscore my insignificance. Men like Caleb, Richard said, the ice clinking against his glass like a gavel, don't build legacies. They occupy space. They're financial anchors disguised as family. Patricia adjusted her pearls, her composed gaze never leaving her plate as she let out a soft, sharp hum of agreement. I looked at Emily, waiting for the fire I used to know, for the woman who once stood by me in a studio apartment with a leaking ceiling. Instead, she tilted her head, a refined, elegant smile touching her lips as she caught her father's eye. "He's comfortable, Dad," she said softly, her voice dismissive, like she was talking about an old piece of furniture. "Some people just don't have the drive to be more." The laughter that followed was polite, refined. It felt like glass shards in my chest. My hands were flat on the white linen, fingers steady despite the roar in my ears. I hadn't touched the prime rib. Richard leaned forward, his commanding voice dropping to a conspiratorial stage whisper. "Must be nice, son. Living off the Lawson momentum while you tinker with your little projects. Useless, but at least you're quiet." My throat burned, not from the sting of their words, but from the sheer weight of my own restraint. I could have laid out the acquisition numbers right there. I could have told them that the tinkering they mocked had just been valued at 7 figures. I could have made a scene that would have shattered their perfect crystal world. But I didn't. Instead, I stood up slowly and straightened my blazer. I reached down, twisted the gold band off my finger, and placed it silently in the center of the table. The clink of the ring against the porcelain was the only sound in the room. Emily's smile froze. Patricia's fork paused midair. I didn't offer an apology. I didn't give them a breakdown. I just turned and walked toward the foyer, the sound of my shoes on the hardwood marking the beat of my own rhythm. I didn't look back. I didn't need to see the shock blooming on their faces. They thought they owned the narrative of my life. They were about to find out I had already finished the final chapter. My name is Caleb Foster. And wherever you're listening from, stay with me, because the night they branded me useless was the night I became their biggest regret. Let them tell their friends I was an anchor. Let them whisper that I couldn't handle the pressure of their standards. Let them lie, because while they were busy measuring my worth by their legacy, I was busy building my own. They should have never mistaken my silence for absence. They should have never handed me that humiliation, because I was about to turn their quiet world into thunder. You learn to keep your head down when you're used to the grind. I wasn't born into spots and spotlights. I was born into the blue-collar hum of a town that didn't have room for refined presence. My father was a mechanic, a man with grease under his fingernails and a spine made of iron. He taught me that a man's value isn't found in his bank account, but in the things he builds when no one is watching. I grew up in a house where the floorboards creaked and the heat was a luxury, but the ambition? That was infinite. I studied by the light of a flickering desk lamp while my peers were out spending their father's money. I didn't have a safety net. I had a keyboard and a vision. That was the man Emily met before her parents' voices became the only ones she could hear. Back then, she called my drive inspiring. Now, she called it useless. They thought they were the ones holding the cards. But you see, when you've spent your life clawing your way up from nothing, you learn the most important lesson of all. Never underestimate the man who has nothing left to lose and everything left to build. The smell of scorched coffee and the blue hum of a CRT monitor were the landmarks of my youth. Long before I stepped into the Lawsons world of refined presence and high-thread count lies, I lived in the shadows of a garage where my father spent his days breathing in gasoline and rust. He was a man of iron and grease who understood the soul of a machine, and he taught me that the things you build with your own hands are the only things that can never be taken from you. While other kids were out under the stadium lights of high school football games, I was hunched over a keyboard in a room where the floorboards creaked under the weight of my ambition. I didn't have a tutor or a trust fund. I had logic, syntax, and a vision that stretched far beyond the zip code of my birth. I remember the first time I made a line of code breathe. It was a simple script, a small thing that automated a diagnostic for my father's shop, but watching those characters flicker across the screen felt like wielding a lightning bolt. It was my secret language, A world where status didn't matter and where your worth was measured by the elegance of your architecture, not the label on your blazer. I took immense pride in that unseen work. It was a quiet, internal fire. I didn't need a standing ovation back then. I just needed the code to be clean, the logic to be sound, and the results to be undeniable. This was the foundation of the man I became. A software engineer who valued the structural integrity of a system over the superficial polish of a presentation. When I eventually moved into the sleek, glass offices of the tech world, I carried that same blue-collar grit with me. I was the one who stayed late when the servers hummed in the dark, finding peace in the solitude of a complex problem. My work was often the invisible spine of the company, the proprietary layers that kept everything moving while the visionaries, in suits, took the credit at the board meetings. I didn't mind. I was a craftsman in a world of marketers. I believed that as long as my work was excellent, I would be safe. I didn't realize then that some people don't look at the foundation of a building, they only care about the view from the penthouse. I was building a fortress of intellectual property, pixel by pixel, never imagining that the woman I loved would one day stand on that very foundation and call it useless. But even as I sat at that dinner table, feeling the cold air of their judgment, I knew one thing they didn't. The code I wrote in the dark was about to bring their entire world into the light. The first time I met Emily, she was a splash of color in a world of grayscale. It was a fundraising gala for a local library, the kind of event where the wine is overpriced and the conversations are paper thin. I was there as a favor to a colleague, leaning against a marble pillar and checking my watch, feeling like a glitch in a very expensive system. Then she appeared, laughing at a joke I hadn't heard, her long blonde hair catching the light of the chandeliers. When our eyes met, she didn't look through me like the others did. She looked at me with a genuine curiosity that I mistook for recognition. "You look like you're calculating the structural integrity of this room," she said, stepping toward me with a playful smirk. I told her I was actually calculating how many lines of code I could have written in the time it took for the appetizers to arrive. She laughed, a warm, melodic sound that seemed to bridge the gap between my world of logic and her world of elegance. In those early days, Emily didn't just accept my grounded nature, she seemed to crave it. She told me she was tired of the polished, hollow men her parents constantly paraded in front of her. She called my silence, strength, and my lack of pretension refreshing. We spent our first few months in a bubble of shared simplicity. I took her to the hole-in-the-wall diners I loved, where the coffee was strong and the booths were torn vinyl. She would sit across from me, her refined presence contrasting beautifully with the grit of the surroundings, and tell me how much she admired my focus. "You're real, Caleb," she'd whisper, her hand resting on mine. "You don't need a title or a legacy to know who you are." I believed her because I wanted to. I thought I had found someone who saw the man beneath the software, the architect beneath the engineer. But looking back, the trap was already being set. Emily wasn't falling in love with my reality, she was falling in love with a project. To her, I was an exotic change of pace, a rugged individualist she could eventually refine and present to her parents like a polished stone. She loved my grounded nature as long as it remained a charming anecdote, a story she could tell at dinner parties about the quiet genius she'd discovered. She didn't realize that being grounded means having roots that go deep, roots that don't easily bend when the wind starts blowing from the direction of her father's mansion. We were happy in the beginning because the stakes were low, but the higher we climbed toward her family's world, the more she began to view my authenticity as a weight, and my quiet pride as a failure to perform. The transition from our shared simplicity to the Lawson reality happened over a Sunday brunch that felt more like an interrogation than a meal. Richard's estate was a fortress of manicured lawns and stone coldness, a place where the air always seemed a few degrees cooler than the rest of the world. We sat on a terrace overlooking a pool that was perfectly still, much like the expression on Richard's face as he watched me. Patricia sat to his right, her posture so rigid it made the wrought iron chair look soft. Emily, usually so vibrant when we were alone, seemed to dim the moment we crossed their threshold, her voice dropping an octave into something rehearsed and careful. Richard didn't waste time with pleasantries. He swirled his espresso, the steam rising like a warning, before pinning me with a gaze that had likely withered subordinates for 40 years. Emily tells me you're still working at that mid-sized firm, Caleb, he began, his voice a low, commanding rumble. Comfortable, I suppose. But comfort is the enemy of progress. I started to mention the architecture I was developing, the proprietary system that was already gaining traction in niche circles, but he raised a hand to silence me. It was a small gesture, but it felt like a door slamming shut. I've spent my life building a name that carries weight, he continued, leaning forward. A legacy is like a high-performance engine. It requires every part to pull its weight. But Emily's future? Well, that's a heavy load to carry. And frankly, looking at your trajectory, I'm concerned you're becoming less of a partner and more of a financial anchor. The word anchor hung in the air, heavy and jagged. I looked at Patricia, expecting a softening glance, but she merely nodded, her composed gaze fixed on her crystal flute. Richard just wants the best for his daughter, Caleb, she added, her tone polite but laced with a passive-aggressive sting. He understands the world in a way you haven't had to yet. I waited for Emily to speak. I waited for her to tell them about the patent I was filing, or the 3 a.m. breakthroughs she used to celebrate with me. Instead, she reached for her water, her eyes fixed on the tablecloth. Dad just wants us to be secure, Caleb, she murmured, her lack of defense cutting deeper than Richard's insult. In that moment, the heat of the afternoon sun felt freezing. I realized then that in this house, my hard work was invisible because it didn't come with a pedigree. To them, I wasn't the man building a future, I was the weight dragging down their gold-plated legacy. I didn't argue. I just picked up my fork, the cold metal a reminder of the iron-willed father who taught me to stay silent until the work was finished. They wanted an anchor, they had no idea I was actually the engine. The shift in Emily wasn't a sudden break, it was a slow erosion, a gradual reseeding of the woman who used to wear my old hoodies while we shared a pizza on the floor. It started with the subtle adjustments, the way she began to critique my choice of tie, then my tone of voice, and finally, my very presence. We were in our bedroom, preparing for another one of her mother's charity galas, when the mirror reflected a stranger standing beside me. She was draped in silk, her long blonde hair pinned back with a precision that felt clinical, her eyes scanning my reflection not with affection, but with the cold eye of a curator. "Caleb, honey," she said, her voice carrying that new, practiced softness she had inherited from Patricia. "I was talking to Mom about the firm's upcoming expansion. She thinks, and I'm starting to agree, that you're staying in that engineering role out of habit, not necessity. It's a bit small, isn't it? For a Lawsons son-in-law." I paused, my hands stilled on my cufflinks. I told her that the small role was where I was finalizing the architecture that would revolutionize data security, the work that actually built things. But she didn't look at me, she looked at the image of us in the glass. "People don't see the code, Caleb. They see the title. They see the impact on the family image," she said, and then she smiled. It was the smile that cut, the same composed, dismissive curve of the lips I had seen on her mother 1,000 times. It was a smile that said my passions were merely inconveniences to be managed. "We need you to aim higher. Not for the work, but for the optics. You're talented, but you're using that talent like a hobbyist. Dad has an opening for a VP of Relations. It's time you stopped tinkering and started representing." In that moment, the distance between us became a canyon. She wasn't asking me to grow, she was asking me to disappear into a suit that didn't fit, to become a decorative piece of the Lawson momentum. Her disrespect was no longer a shadow cast by her parents, it had become her own light. She had grown dismissive of the very grit she once claimed to love, viewing my hard-earned self-worth as a lack of ambition. As she reached over to straighten my collar, her touch felt like a brand. I realized she no longer saw the man who had built himself from nothing. She only saw a rough draft that she and her mother were determined to edit until I was unrecognizable. I stayed silent, letting her believe her smile had won, while internally, I began to double the encryption on the life I was building away from her. The 3 a.m. darkness of my home office became my sanctuary, the only place where the Lawson influence couldn't penetrate. While Emily slept soundly down the hall, dreaming of social calendars and the optics of our lives, I was submerged in the rhythmic glow of 3 monitors. This was the fortress. Here, I wasn't the useless son-in-law or the financial anchor. I was the architect of a system so robust it was already sending tremors through the industry. My fingers moved across the mechanical keyboard with the same precision my father used when tuning an engine, each line of code a brick in the wall I was building between my future and their contempt. I had entered the final stages of a secret acquisition deal with a global tech conglomerate. The numbers were staggering, 7 figures, with a retention bonus that dwarfed Richard Lawson's annual dividends. But to Emily, these late-night sessions were just further proof of my aimlessness. One night, she drifted into the room, squinting against the blue light, her silk robe trailing behind her like a ghost of the woman she used to be. "Still at it, Caleb?" she asked, her voice heavy with a condescending fatigue. She leaned against the doorframe, not looking at the complex data visualizations on my screens, but at the empty coffee mugs and the disheveled state of my hair. "Dad was asking if you'd looked at that VP role again. Whatever this is, it looks like you're just playing games to avoid growing up. It's a hobby, Caleb. Real men don't play games in the dark, they lead in the light." I didn't turn around. I couldn't. If I had, she might have seen the fire in my eyes that no amount of her mother's polished influence could extinguish. I just told her I was finishing up. She let out a short, sharp sigh, the kind Patricia used when a waiter was too slow, and walked away, leaving me in a silence that felt like a shield. She didn't know that the game I was playing was about to change the scoreboard forever. Every bug I squashed, every security protocol I hardened, was a step toward my liberation. I was securing patents, signing NDAs with encrypted digital signatures, and moving the intellectual property into a private entity they couldn't touch. I was building a life they hadn't given me permission to have, using the very tinkering they mocked to buy my way out of their prison. They saw a man hiding from reality. I saw a man preparing to shatter theirs. As the sun began to bleed through the blinds, I hit the final commit on the acquisition framework. The fortress was complete. Now, all I had to do was wait for the right moment to walk out and let the walls collapse behind me. The dining room was a theater of excess, draped in the heavy scent of lilies and the suffocating arrogance of the Lawson name. It was meant to be a celebration of Richard's latest acquisition, but the air felt more like a courtroom where my presence was the only thing on trial. Richard sat at the head of the table like a king on a temporary throne, his commanding voice booming as he recounted his triumphs to a handful of influential guests who nodded with practiced sycophancy. Patricia sat to his left, her sharp gaze sweeping the table to ensure every fork was in its proper place, while Emily sat beside me, her refined presence now indistinguishable from the cold marble of the fireplace. The conversation eventually turned to me, as I knew it would. It was the entertainment portion of the evening. Richard swirled his vintage red, the deep color catching the candlelight as he looked my way with a smirk that didn't reach his eyes. "You know," he started, his voice dropping to that patronizing rumble, "we've tried to help Caleb find his footing. We offered him a seat at the table, a title that actually means something in this city. But some men are just content to stay in the basement, aren't they?" The table went quiet. Emily didn't look up from her plate. She just reached for her wine, a small, dismissive smile playing on her lips, the same smile that had once been my home, now turned into a weapon. "He's my financial anchor," Richard continued, letting out a short, sharp laugh that the guests echoed like a chorus. "A hobbyist who thinks he's an architect. It's almost admirable, really, the way he stays so busy doing absolutely nothing of value. Useless in the grand scheme of things, but he keeps the chair warm." I felt the heat rise in my throat, not from shame, but from the absolute clarity of the moment. This was the last supper of my old life. I looked at Emily, giving her one final chance to be the woman I had married, but she didn't even blink. She just nodded at her father's words, confirming that my worth in her eyes had officially hit 0. I didn't scream. I didn't defend the 7-figure acquisition that had been finalized only hours before, or the life-changing technology that now belonged to me and me alone. Instead, I stood up slowly, the movement silent and deliberate. The room went still. I reached down, twisted the gold band off my finger, and placed it on the edge of my untouched plate. It made a small, final clink against the porcelain, the sound of a system crashing. I didn't say a word. I just turned and walked toward the exit, leaving behind the most expensive humiliation they could offer, and stepping into the power they never saw coming. The dining room was a theater of excess, draped in the heavy scent of lilies and the suffocating arrogance of the Lawson name. It was meant to be a celebration of Richard's latest acquisition, but the air felt more like a courtroom where my presence was the only thing on trial. Richard sat at the head of the table like a king on a temporary throne, his commanding voice booming as he recounted his triumphs to a handful of influential guests who nodded with practiced sycophancy. Patricia sat to his right, her sharp gaze sweeping the table to ensure every fork was in its proper place, while Emily sat beside me, her refined presence now indistinguishable from the cold marble of the fireplace. The conversation eventually turned to me, as I knew it would. It was the entertainment portion of the evening. Richard swirled his vintage red, the deep color catching the candlelight as he looked my way with a smirk that didn't reach his eyes. "You know," he started, his voice dropping to that patronizing rumble, "we've tried to help Caleb find his footing. We offered him a seat at the table, a title that actually means something in this city. But some men are just content to stay in the basement, aren't they?" The table went quiet. Emily didn't look up from her plate. She just reached for her wine, a small, dismissive smile playing on her lips, the same smile that had once been my home, now turned into a weapon. "He's my financial anchor," Richard continued, letting out a short, sharp laugh that the guests echoed like a chorus. "A hobbyist who thinks he's an architect. It's almost admirable, really, the way he stays so busy doing absolutely nothing of value. Useless in the grand scheme of things, but he keeps the chair warm." I felt the heat rise in my throat, not from shame, but from the absolute clarity of the moment. This was the last supper of my old life. I looked at Emily, giving her one final chance to be the woman I had married, but she didn't even blink. She just nodded at her father's words, confirming that my worth in her eyes had officially hit zero. I didn't scream. I didn't defend the seven-figure acquisition that had been finalized only hours before, or the life-changing technology that now belonged to me and me alone. Instead, I stood up slowly, the movement silent and deliberate. The room went still. I reached down, twisted the gold band off my finger, and placed it on the edge of my untouched plate. It made a small, final clink against the porcelain, the sound of a system crashing. I didn't say a word. I just turned and walked toward the exit, leaving behind the most expensive humiliation they could offer, and stepping into the power they never saw coming. The morning after the dinner, the sun rose on a world that had fundamentally shifted, though the Lawsons didn't know it yet. While they were likely waking up in their fortress of stone, rehearsing the story of my cowardly exit to their social circle, I was sitting in a glass-walled conference room across town. I wasn't wearing a Lawson-approved suit. I was wearing the same calm, thoughtful expression that had once made them mistake me for a pushover. With a single keystroke, I authorized the public launch of the architecture I had spent years perfecting. The system went live, and the dominoes began to fall with a surgical, digital precision. The Lawson fortune wasn't built on innovation, it was built on legacy infrastructure and high-interest middleman logistics, the exact kind of bloat my software was designed to eliminate. By noon, the system failure began. It wasn't a glitch, it was an obsolescence. The tech conglomerate that acquired my patent moved with predatory speed, offering a cheaper, faster, and more secure alternative that rendered Richard's primary holdings irrelevant within a single trading cycle. I watched the markets react from my monitor, the flickering green and red lines telling a story of a kingdom built on sand. Richard's frantic calls started around 2. I didn't answer. I could almost picture him in his study, the commanding voice now frayed with a panic he couldn't control as he watched his net worth evaporate. He had called me an anchor, but he was the one sinking now, weighed down by a legacy that couldn't keep pace with the man he'd mocked. Patricia's social standing followed the capital. The friends who had chuckled at my expense at dinner were the first to pull their investments and distance themselves from the Lawson name. In their world, nothing is more contagious than failure. Emily's messages were different. They started with anger, accusing me of sabotage, but by sunset, they had dissolved into a bewildered, refined desperation. She finally understood that the playing games she had ridiculed was actually the sound of the foundation being pulled out from under her feet. They had viewed my silence as a lack of power, never realizing that silence is where the most dangerous work happens. The momentum Richard had bragged about hadn't just slowed down, it had crashed into a reality they weren't prepared to face. I wasn't a hobbyist, and I wasn't an anchor. I was the architect of the new world, and for the first time in 42 years, the air smelled like freedom. The system hadn't just failed them, it had finally started working for me. The stage was a vast, dark expanse, illuminated only by the sharp geometric glow of the LED screens behind me. Standing at the center of the auditorium, the air hummed with the expectant energy of 5,000 engineers, investors, and visionaries. I looked out at the sea of faces, and for a moment, I saw the ghost of a dining room table draped in white linen and the cold, judgmental eyes of a man who thought he could define me. But that room was small, and this world was wide. I began to speak, my voice steady and resonant, not with the arrogance of a legacy, but with the quiet authority of a craftsman who had survived the fire. I spoke about the architecture of resilience. I told them that the most powerful systems aren't the ones built in the spotlight, but the ones forged in the silence of the 3 a.m. hours, when no one is watching and the world tells you that you are useless. I watched as the audience leaned in, realizing that I wasn't just giving them a technical blueprint, I was giving them a manifesto for a new kind of power. The applause wasn't a polite, socialite's chuckle. It was a roar, a recognition of the grit it takes to build a fortress when everyone around you is trying to tear down your foundation. Backstage, the adrenaline began to cool into a profound sense of peace. My assistant handed me my tablet, a stream of notifications flickering across the glass like distant lightning. Among the requests for interviews and the multi-million-dollar partnership offers, a single notification caught my eye. It was an email from Emily. The subject line was 3 words long. Can we talk? I paused, looking at her name. I thought of the woman who had smiled while her father called me an anchor. I thought of the refined presence that had become a mask for a lack of loyalty. I felt no anger, no surge of vengeful triumph, only a quiet, sterile detachment. She didn't want to talk to Caleb Foster, the man she'd known. She wanted to talk to the blueprint of success she saw on her newsfeed. She was still looking for the optics, still chasing the momentum of a name that carried weight. I didn't open the message. I didn't need to hear the explanations or the apologies that were only arriving because the bank accounts had run dry. With a single, deliberate swipe, I moved the email to the archive. I wasn't a project to be edited or a financial anchor to be deployed when the seas got rough. I was a man who had finally rewritten his own code. As I walked out of the venue and into the cool evening air, I realized that the greatest success wasn't the acquisition or the standing ovation. It was the fact that I no longer needed her to see me to know that I existed. I had built my own light, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't just standing in it, I was the source. The windows of my new office stretched from the floor to the soaring ceiling, offering a panoramic view of the city I had once traversed as an invisible man. The afternoon sun caught the glass, casting long, sharp shadows across the minimalist space. On the wall behind my desk hung a simple plaque, its surface a brushed, dark granite. It didn't list my degrees or my title. It simply bore the date I walked out of that dinner, and a single line of code that had been the heartbeat of my transformation. I traced the etched letters with my thumb, feeling the cool, unyielding strength of the stone. For years, I had allowed the Lawsons to make me feel like a guest in my own life, as if I were lucky to be offered a seat at a table where I was never truly welcome. I had spent so much energy trying to prove I wasn't an anchor that I nearly forgot I was the one who knew how to build the ship. Standing here now, the silence of the room wasn't the heavy, suffocating weight of the Lawson dining hall. It was the quiet, expansive peace of a man who had finally come home to himself. I thought of the garage where my father had worked, the smell of grease and the sound of his steady, rhythmic labor. He had built things to last, things that stood the test of time because their integrity was forged in the foundation, not the polish. I had honored that legacy by building something they could never buy, steal, or dismiss. Richard and Emily had looked at me and seen a useful accessory, a man whose only value was his proximity to their status. They never realized that while they were busy guarding their door, I was out here, leveling the ground and pouring the concrete for a skyscraper of my own. I didn't need their permission to succeed, and I certainly didn't need their seat at the table to feast. Looking out over the skyline, I realized that the greatest victory wasn't the financial ruin of my enemies or the public acclaim of my peers. It was the absolute, ironclad certainty that I had built this entire building myself, from the granite foundation to the glass crown. I wasn't just a part of the system anymore, I was the one who defined it. As I turned back to my desk to start the next project, I felt a deep, resonant warmth in my chest. They thought they were the ones who owned the world. But I was the one who knew how to build it. You know, as I sit here in this office, looking out at a skyline I built with my own hands, I can't help but think back to that dinner. I remember the exact sound of that gold ring hitting the porcelain plate. It was the loudest silence I've ever experienced. But the most important lesson I learned that night, the one I want you to take away, is that your value is not a negotiation. For years, I let the Lawsons define me. I let them treat my hard work like a hobby and my silence like weakness. I was waiting for them to give me a seat at a table that was designed to keep me small. But here's the truth. If you're sitting at a table where your worth is being debated, you're at the wrong table. The world will try to tell you that you're useless or an anchor just because you aren't playing their game or shouting about your wins. Don't waste your breath trying to convince them otherwise. Don't give them the dignity of a scene. Instead, take that energy and put it into your 3 a.m. fortress. Build your own foundation so deep and so strong that when you finally walk away, their entire world shakes. Success isn't about the apology you'll never get from people like Richard or Emily. It's about the moment you realize you don't need their eyes to see your own light. I'm going to keep sharing these stories, not just of betrayal, but of the surgical, quiet strategies we use to reclaim our lives and build our own empires. If you're ready to stop being an accessory in someone else's story and start becoming the architect of your own, then hit that subscribe button. Join this community. Let's build something together that they can never take away. Because remember, they didn't break you. They just showed you who you weren't, so you could finally remember who you are. I'll see you in the next video.